a lot of your podcast is dedicated to the guests and their ideas. After having interviewed some of the top scientists in the US and the world, do you think there are overlooked areas of science where maybe if you weren't working on TOE, you would investigate these sort of areas?
So algorithmic information theory, that's David Wolpart's with the limiting theorems, like no free lunch theorems. David Wolpart said the largest philosophical results are in algorithmic information theory. So that's an intersection of computation and information, and it has to do with complexity. Like, you've heard this term Kolmogorov complexity. Have you heard of it?
No.
Okay, so the Kolmogorov complexity of something is how much information is needed to specify it. So for instance, you think pi, the digits are infinite, so maybe you need an infinite amount of information to specify it. No, because there's a formula. So how much information goes into that formula? Oh, okay, another way of thinking of it is like, you have some a program gives you an output, like on your phone, there's some output, or on your computer. Then you wonder, well, how much information was in the program needed to generate that output? So you can look at the output and you can think, well, it's extremely complex, like a fractal. Actually, a fractal is like 3 terms, like z equals so-and-so. So that's Kolmogorov complexity. It turns out calculating the Kolmogorov complexity is itself uncomputable in general, meaning that there is no algorithm to compute the Kolmogorov complexity. Gödel's incompleteness theorem isn't exactly algorithmic information theory, but it's tangent to it. So that's an interesting result. So that's something that I would study. Category theory. So I interview so many people on their different TOEs, and people often ask, well, what's your favorite TOE? And I see them as if they're different TOEs, but I'm thinking like they're often reflections of something deeper. And they're imprecise, and there's often mud and dirt that needs to be wiped off. So it's not completely, I'm touching the trunk, I'm touching the leg, you're touching the tail. It's not completely that. But it's more like, imagine you can expand that where some people, like, I smell the grass. Oh, I feel like I'm being bathed. And then that's still part of the elephant, because the elephant smells like grass in its best case. And then you're being rained on because the trunk is outputting water. So more like experiential claims as well, not just all feeling, but other senses. So I get that they're reflections of something. And what I'm attempting to do and doing just unconsciously is like this metaphysical Rosetta Stone, where there are different concepts being talked about, with different words and different. So Chris Langan may say, this is a syntactic covering of so-and-so. Then you're like, what's a syntactic covering? And this person may call it something else. And you realize, oh, they're talking about the same. So what I am attempting to do is a metaphysical Rosetta Stone. And then there's this branch of mathematics called category theory, which itself is a Rosetta Stone of math. So there are these different sections of math. So physics can be considered a section of math, where you have physical systems. So like this could be a physical system, and then you do something to it. So you transform it, you light it on fire, and then it becomes another physical system. Or even this, and then you leave it there, or like this. That was a transformation of this system. So you have a system, transformation goes to another system. Okay. In math, you have axioms, and then you do something, which is the proof or deduction, to come up with another statement. So you have statements, which is the deduction, statements. Physics, you have systems, transformation, physical transformation, another system. Computer science, you have data types. You do something to it, which is the program, and you come up with another data type or something else. So it turns out that between math, which is the axioms, proof, another set of statements, and computer science, which is types, data types, and then you do something to the program and you come out with some output. There's an analogy, an exact analogy, and that's called the Curry-Howard correspondence. That's like from the 1970s. That alone blows my mind. Then it turns out that there's a correspondence between the way that the systems in physics work, which transform into another system, and the way that math works, and the way that computer science works, and that's encapsulated with category theory. And it's the same as just as logic and logical deductions, and I forgot the fourth one. Regardless, category theory is a Rosetta Stone of mathematics, of logical thinking. So I'm curious if category theory can be used to help me come up with this Rosetta Stone of TOEs.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, if TOEs are based in something analytical, which I don't think they are, and it may be the case that even conceiving of TOE as partially analytic, maybe diminishing and completely misleading.
Right.
That may be the case.
Yes.
But either way, I'm willing to explore it in the same way that some scientists, I think, should be willing to explore what there is no evidence for. You go out and explore. Like, that's how you find the borders. Like, most ideas are horrible and will fail, but you have to test several.
Yes. That's so interesting. So category theory is to, I guess it's dependent on it being math based.
I think the fourth one was category theory itself. Sorry.
Okay.
So category theory you have what are called objects and then morphisms to another object. So it's like a point, and then you have an edge to another point.
And so the question is, can you do a similar Rosetta Stone mapping of toes, which would be fascinating.
That's one of the reasons I wanted to make that artistic piece, because that would help me. It wouldn't be precise because it's not, like David Wolpert would say, those are just words in a sense.
Yeah.
But it gives me an intuition, and that's what I build off of, or that's what any scientist builds off of, a researcher builds off of.
That would be fascinating to just build a true map. What would the map sort of look like? Like, would it look like a database or like a relational database sort of thing? Or
one of the easiest answers is to just take theoretical physics, which is already relegating reality to just what physics is, and then relegating that to theoretical physics. And then take, okay, what are the contenders for toes in theories of everything in the physical sense, the theoretical physical sense? So string theory, loop quantum gravity, perhaps, geometric unity, Wolfram, Garrett-Lisi, shape dynamics, causal dynamic triangulation, and so on. Okay, so you take maybe 10, and then you put them on the x-axis, and then you say, okay, what are the unresolved problems in physics? And you put that on the y-axis. So there's, well, I can give you some later if you're going to include this. So there's there's about 20 unsolved problems in physics that are considered like these are major problems.
Yep.
Whether or not they are, even that's a bit somewhat controversial, but regardless.
So you put them like quantum gravity.
Yes, can you make this? Can you quantize gravity or geometrize the quantum?
Right.
Like Weinstein said, like unify them in some way.
Yep.
And why neutrinos, do neutrinos have mass or neutrino oscillation? There's some other problems, CP violation, so on, so whatever. And then check marks. Which theories solve which ones? So that's one way of at least showing diagrammatically a relationship between them, but then they're not subsets of one another. That's like a ranking of the toes rather than a relationship of them. But that's something that I'm working on with a mathematician friend of mine named Carlos Zapata.
Cool. And
he works for the Wolfram Institute, but I told him he's not allowed to be biased against who cares.
Well, I think why that would be so interesting is it goes back to your answer to the question of like why you're not good at answering a question. If you don't know the answer, you usually just say, I don't know. And you go down this sort of like database of your own knowledge or whatever. Just having a map of like quantum gravity solves this, but it creates this problem. Literally just seeing that with like the 20 most credible toes, I think would be really cool.
Yeah.
And then you can sort of play whack-a-mole and like maybe mix and match in certain places and then try to reconcile theory instead of it, the Holy Grail always being quantum field theory and, relativity or whatever. Maybe it could be like two new toes that are like derivatives of like, they're attempting to solve that, but like maybe those two new toes actually are compatible based on the pros and cons or something.
I often think we think that the problem, or we've been told that the problem is quantum gravity. Weinstein says like, that's this huge distraction because there are other problems. Yeah. But I also think rather than trying to combine quantum field theory and general relativity or the standard model and general relativity, we think that it's like a jigsaw puzzle. We just have to find the right angle. How do you know that there's just these two pieces? What if there's 12 other pieces or 25 other pieces and these two don't directly connect? This connects to this, which connects to this, which connects to this, which connects to that. Maybe it's not even 2D. Maybe it's 3D.
Totally.
Maybe they're not supposed to connect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point.
Then your mind just explodes and then you're just left in a pool just looking at the sun and wondering about your existence.
Yeah, we're not good at multivariant systems. Like we need to concatenate everything into like something super coherent. Yeah. And it's like, I know the answer, but and also we think of that as something demeaning, but I also wonder how much of that there's something loving about that. Like we often think loving is like the connections and the union and you become one with. Jonathan Pajot said that. Jonathan Pajot, you know? I don't.
Okay, so Jonathan Pajot is like a symbolist. He studies symbols.
Okay.
A Christian iconographer, I
Cool.
believe.
Yeah.
He said that the Christian way to salvation is different than the non-dualist way. And this is something Wolfgang Smith, who the reason I came to LA, also echoes. So we have this perennial view that all religions have some aspect of truth. And I tend to have that because I'm just like a liberal person and I want that to be the case.
Yeah.
So I tend to always try to find, well, what's the commonality between them? What's the truth between them?
Yeah.
He was saying that started actually in the early 1900s by a few people who corrupted this and said like almost every religion has something credible to it. I'm not saying I believe their ideas, but I'm just saying this is what they say. And that's called perennialism, just so you know. And the Baha'i faith, I believe, is one of them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. So I'll put a huge asterisk.
Well, Baha'i is definitely like all the at least monotheistic religions they're all right or something.
Yeah,
you
like
know?
let's interweave them, or they're synchronistic. They're synchronistic with one another. Okay, so he would say there is just two real religions, and one is the Vedic traditions. So not even Buddhism, because Vedic has some contradictions with Buddhism, namely about gods and what you should do, which is sacrificing and so on.
Right.
Rituals and so on. And Buddhism is like non-theistic and just focuses on the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path. So the Vedic tradition and then the Christian tradition. And then often we, in our spiritual circles, the ones that we run in, we hear, and we also, at least for myself, tend to think, no, you know, the Eastern one is the one that's more encompassing.
Right.
And the Eastern one encompasses the West. And so the Western is like so literal and so prosaic. But actually, this is something I've come to think about for the past few months, independent of them. I was wondering, you know, is it the case that we're just so absolutely used to the West because we grew up in it? We understand the linear progress of God did this and Abraham came and Jesus did this and sacrificed on the cross and so on. We just see that as, it's just, we don't even think about it. We just understand it like this. Is it the case that the East has just been so influenced by the West in the past 100 years or so that they're able to comprehend it in the same way? But we look at the West, we look at the East, in the West, we look at the East as being colorful and being so open and creative, like, wow, there's so many ideas. There's spirits and reincarnation and so on.
Yeah.
But they look at that in the same way we look at Christianity. It's like, that's just so prosaic and bromidic and flatlined. And when they hear about Christianity for the first time, they're like, oh, whoa, I don't know how you make sense of that. So it turns out that is the case, that that Sanskrit, there is no word for sin. They have no concept of salvation or the fall of Adam and Eve. So I didn't know that. This is something Wolfgang was telling me. He's saying that like in the Vedic tradition, they just can't comprehend that. If you speak to some of the people who aren't influenced by Christianity from like the 1940s or 1930s or so on. So Jonathan Pagel says the Christian way of salvation is unity with God, but it's retaining your multiplicity and actually becoming more multiple, which is something that we can't do. We don't even have the words for or the concepts for. Like we think unity means same as. But there's a phrase that Jonathan Pagel said, quoting someone, maybe C.S. Lewis, that the blades of grass in heaven are too sharp for man. Meaning that somehow heaven, rather than this being illusory, which is what the Vedic traditions tend to emphasize.
Maya. Yeah.
Yes. The Western tradition tends to emphasize, no, this is real and it will only become more real.
Oh,
like
that's so
the blades
cool.
of grass are so sharp.
Yeah.
You can't handle them right now.
Yeah.
You're going to, like he says, Jonathan Pagel says, Saint Paul will be more saints-like rather than being more God-like and just in a sea of nothingness. So that's extremely, extremely interesting to think about. If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.